Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is ISO New England's CASPR and state RPSs. This webinar is being presented by the RPS Collaborative, which is a program of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And this webinar is being hosted by CESA's Executive Director and also the Director of the RPS Collaborative, Warren Leon. And we have with us a guest speaker, Paul Peterson from Synapse Energy. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled there. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments using the questions box on the webinar console and hit send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we'll get to as many questions as time allows. We're hoping to save about 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A following the presentation. So submit your questions when you think of them. The sooner you get them in, the more likely you are to get them answered. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We are going to send you a follow-up email within about 24 to 48 hours with a link to the webinar recording and a copy of the slides as well. And we'll also be posting all of those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that taken care of, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. As I mentioned, Warren is the Executive Director of CESA. And Warren, you might be muted.
Thanks very much, Samantha. I sure was muted. I want everyone to see our members up here on the screen. Clean Energy States Alliance is a membership organization composed of public agencies, mostly state agencies across the country, and you could see them on the screen. And one of our activities is to run the RPS Collaborative, which you will see on the next slide. This is something that is funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. It's an information sharing and networking initiative for state RPS program administrators, for federal agency representatives, and for anyone else who's interested in the management and administration of state RPSs. We write papers on topics of interest to our audience. We do webinars like this one. We have a monthly newsletter with news from about RPSs around the country, and we do an annual summit meeting in Washington, D.C. You could see our archival material, and you could sign up for the newsletter and the announcements by going to our website, cesa.org, and looking under the project tab for the RPS Collaborative. If we can go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be focusing on a topic that quite a few people asked us to do a webinar on. CASPR is something that is being implemented by ISO New England. It's important for the way clean energy is implemented in the region. It's important for understanding how ISO New England is going to be operating in the future years. And unfortunately, it's quite complicated. So what we did was we got the person that many people said is the one guy who could actually explain CASPR in a clear and thorough manner. That's Paul Peterson. Paul is a principal with Synapse Energy Economics. He has over 35 years of experience with energy efficiency policy issues and with clean energy issues through work with the University of Vermont Extension Service, the Vermont Public Service Board, ISO New England, and since 2001 with Synapse Energy Economics. Much of his work focuses on regional transmission organizations, wholesale markets, and system planning. So I will turn it over to him to explain to us what CASPR is and how it will work.
Thank you, Warren. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today. Look forward to the presentation, and particularly the discussion afterwards. Some of the early slides are pretty perfunctory. I'm going to move through these a little quickly. We'll have longer times on some of the later slides. Just briefly, Synapse Energy Economics, founded in 1996. I believe there are 2 people who worked there then. We're now a staff of 30. We are experts in energy and environmental economics. We also are experts in environmental compliance issues. My experience, as Warren just detailed to you from my background, is primarily with wholesale markets and system planning. And I've listed a few of the entities I've been employed by over the years. For the agenda today, we're going to look at a little bit at the New England forward capacity market, how it was initially designed, how it kind of works. There's not going to be a lot of detail here. And then look at a few of the significant changes that have occurred and then some of the results. This is all kind of background but necessary foundation building in order to understand how CASPR interacts with the forward capacity market, because CASPR is kind of an addition to the forward capacity market. It doesn't replace it. It doesn't change a lot of the basic functions of the existing forward capacity market. It's kind of an add-on to it. When we discuss CASPR, I'll go through some of the design elements and concerns, a very simplified example of the basic operation of CASPR, some issues and concerns that I will raise for you to think about, and then we'll go to probably 10, 15, maybe more minutes of just discussion, answering questions. So the New England forward capacity market, or as we call it, the FCM, is a 3 years forward market for a 1-year commitment. That means you're offering up a resource 3 years prior to guaranteeing it will be available in the delivery year. In a lot of respects, it's actually a 4-year forward market. And the reason I say that is the auctions occur in February of each year for the commitment period that begins in June. So in February of this past year, 2018, we held the auction for resources that would have a capacity supply obligation, which is what you get out of this forward capacity market, in the years 2021, 2022, starting June 1st of 2021. So that's 3 years from the auction in February. But as we'll see later, you actually have to start submitting information almost an entire year before that. There's a very significant piece of information that goes in of June the year before. So you're making a lot of decisions really 4 years in advance. And this is one of the more important elements of the forward capacity market, is being comfortable and being able to predict where you will be 4 years in the future in order to know how to offer into these markets. All the resources that are new offer in at a price. Now, whatever price they're proposing to offer in at can be reviewed by the independent market monitor. The independent market monitor can, the internal market monitor can reject the price as being inappropriate or ask for additional information to justify whatever price is being offered. And this is an important part of the process, is getting a price that can pass the internal market monitor's scrutiny. The market monitor is concerned both about owners of resources that want to try to make the price higher or artificially higher in the forward capacity auction, and also owners of resources that might be wanting to make the clearing price in the auction artificially lower. So they look at both sides of it and try to make sure people are offering at a cost-justified price based on a pretty lengthy set of criteria that the internal market monitor reviews. All existing resources that have a capacity supply obligation already, are required to offer in at zero. The idea is that they are already in the marketplace and they will be price takers of whatever price is determined by those new resources. However, existing resources can also offer a delist price. This is a kind of a walk-away price. They're saying if the price goes to a certain low level, whatever they feel is low enough for them, they will take the resource away either for a year or possibly try to permanently delist it. They have several different options about how to delist. There's also a dynamic delist option that occurs during the auction itself. So there are several ways that resources who are existing can opt out, but they are in at zero unless they have again, this is an internal market monitor approved delist amount. It can't just be a price they make up. It has to be somehow cost-based, cost-justified. Then they can leave the auction if the auction price goes below that delist amount that they have submitted. The market uses a demand curve, which establishes a range of quantities at various prices. It's an administrative curve. It's overlaid against all the supply offers. And then a new resource offer or a dealer's price will set the clearing price for all when that is hit. Within the New England market, there are zonal variations that can occur. Most recently, there have been distinctions between northeastern or northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont have all kind of been a single zone, and southeast, northeast Massachusetts has often been a single zone, and then the rest of Pool, which is largely Connecticut and western Massachusetts, is considered the rest of Pool is the non-zonally constrained. Zonal constraints occur for a variety of reasons, most often because a resource is either retiring, load has grown very rapidly in a particular area and there aren't enough resources within that zone to satisfy the need, or there are transmission constraints, either old ones or new ones, that prevent quantities from freely flowing from one zone to another, and so therefore the prices will vary. Most of the time, over most of the year, New England is an uncongested system. That's considered to be a great benefit because it allows the lowest price resources to set the price for the entire pool, and the theory is that everyone benefits when that occurs, from having the lowest price across the entire pool. Whereas if there are needs to separate by zones, you'll generally have higher prices in those zones that are constrained. When a resource clears the forward capacity market, it takes on a capacity supply obligation, or CSO, expressed in megawatts. So typically a 100 megawatt generation resource will try to clear the full 100 megawatts and get a capacity supply obligation of 100 megawatts. There are situations where the resources can bid in blocks. So maybe the first 80 megawatts of that 100 megawatt resource will clear, but the remaining 20 megawatts does not. So then the resource has a capacity supply obligation of 80 megawatts. Resources are paid on a monthly basis. The payment is $1 per kW payment. So when you see these prices, those are dollars per kW, so you have to multiply by 1,000 to get to a megawatt, and then multiply times 12 months, and that's the annual payment per megawatt that a resource would receive. And we can take, if you have specific questions, we can probably answer these later about the market. The next slide talks about the forward capacity auction. The first thing that happens when we're scheduling the auction in March of this year, 2018, to get prepared for the FCA auction will occur in February of 2019. In March, all resources that want to retire have to submit their retirement offers. All new resources have to submit a show of interest package that states a maximum quantity that they may want to bid into the forward capacity auction that's going to occur in February. Both the retirement offers and the show of interest offers are reviewed by the ISO to see if they can be allowed. There's questions on retirements of whether or not a resource might be needed for reliability, whether that's pool-wide reliability or a local reliability issue. Sometimes retirement offers can be rejected because a resource is needed. And there are a lot of things that happen after that if that's the path that goes, how the path goes. Other times, retirement offers are accepted or put into the auction at a particular price. And if the price gets to that level, then the resource will retire. And retirement means not only that you don't get a capacity supply obligation in that auction, but you will never get one in the future. And you will have to give up your interconnection rights at the same time when you retire the resource. This is different from delist bids. Delist bids do not require a retirement, but a retirement offer requires you to leave the system. After the show of interest in June, again, this is going to come up in the next month, June of 2018, all new resources will have to submit a qualification package, which is a much more detailed estimate or statement of what they want to offer into the forward capacity auction. They have to submit some financial assurance along with that qualification package. And if they decide later that they either don't get approval for qualified capacity or they elect to withdraw, they will forfeit that financial assurance that they've paid. That occurs in June, and from June till about the end of September, the ISO reviews all the new requests and sees if they can be accommodated by the existing transmission system and the existing pattern of where generators are. Sometimes a new resource cannot be accommodated and it will be disqualified from the auction because it doesn't fit within a particular zone or area. By the end of September, ISO sends out letters to everyone saying, here is the qualified capacity amount that you can submit into the forward capacity auction, the maximum amount you can submit. Then there's an offer window in which owners of resources, both new and existing, can decide what portion of their resource they're going to offer in at what price if they're a new resource, or what portion of the resource they might want to delist, or maybe delist the entire resource during that offer window opportunity. That, I believe, closes sometime in December or January, and then in February the auction actually runs. It's a descending clock auction, starts at a high value, dollars per kilowatt month, and they reduce it on a step basis as the results roll on. And eventually, when enough resources drop out and the price drops down because it's gotten lower than what they want to accept for a capacity supply obligation, supply and demand meet, and there's a clearing price, a capacity supply obligation award triggers additional financial assurance right immediately after the auction. There's a short period of time which you have to post more financial assurance with the ISO. The idea behind financial assurance is just to try to ensure that resources that say they're going to be there really will show up 3 years in the future when the auction, when the delivery period begins. And if they're not able to perform 3 years in the future, then they can sometimes get an extension and they may lose some of their financial assurance, or if they're really never going to get built, then they would tend to lose all of their financial assurance. So that's background on the forward capacity market, forward capacity auctions. One of the important things added to the forward capacity market at the same time that the demand curve was implemented for FCA 7 was a renewable technology resource exemption. And the RTR, as it was called, was defined generally as resources eligible for state RPS programs. Missing as a resource that could qualify as an RTR resource would be large-scale hydro from Canada. That was specifically not included as a resource eligible for the RTR exemption. The RTR exemption allows a renewable technology resource to offer into the FCA without meeting the minimum offer price requirements, that review I was talking about earlier that the internal market monitor does, to ensure both that prices aren't too high and that people are trying to offer at, and also ensuring that prices aren't too low. The very simple example for a renewable resource is, let's say you're an offshore wind project, and based on your costs, the internal market monitor might say, okay, your minimum price that you can offer in the auction is $14. Well, if that offshore wind resources offers in at $14, it's highly unlikely that they will clear the auction. They won't get a capacity supply obligation. So the RTR exemption is kind of a backdoor way for that wind resource to get a capacity supply obligation. But the amount of that can offer each FCA was capped at 200 megawatts. So in each auction, there was a maximum of 200 megawatts of renewable technology resources that could offer into the forward capacity auction without having to meet that minimum offer price requirement that the internal market monitor sets. If there was not 200 megawatts in an FCA, the difference between the amount that did clear and the 200 rolls over to the next auction up to a maximum of 600 megawatts allowed over multiple FCAs. And through FCA 12, 4 auctions, approximately 136 megawatts of renewable technology resources cleared. Some people said this was evidence that the RTR wasn't that helpful for renewables. Other people said, well, it's more a question of there aren't that many renewable technology resources out there just yet, but in the future there might be a lot more. One of the things that CASPR did is it eliminated that RTR exemption. In the discussions about CASPR, many stakeholders wanted to retain the RTR exemption as an additional insurance policy or as a backstop in case nothing came out of the CASPR substitution option. As kind of a compromise, the ISO proposes to phase out the RTR over the next 3 auctions by allowing resources that can still, small amounts of renewable technology resources can still come in. They will not be subject to minimum offer price, and they can bid in at whatever price they want to try to clear the auction and get a capacity supply obligation. But no, the maximum amount that can meet that over the next 3 auctions is about 500 megawatts. And ISO said that they removed the RTR exemption because they believe it's no longer needed and actually creates a conflict with the operation of CASPR. This was a very heavily debated issue. The New England states were very supportive of retaining the RTR exemption. It was a element changed because they wanted to see renewable technology resources into the auction and get capacity supply obligations. And we'll discuss that more under the CASPR details as well as to why that was important. The other very significant thing you have to be made aware of, particularly if you're considering renewable resources that have a variable energy production. This is the issue called pay for performance. It was implemented beginning with FCA number 9. That's for the delivery year that actually begins June 1st, 2018. So pay for performance is going to be, for the first time ever, in effect starting June 1st of this year. All resources that have a capacity supply obligation are subject to performance penalties and rewards. All the rewards and penalties are balanced between market resources. This was done as a protection in some ways so that consumers do not get saddled with any of these rewards or get saddled with any of the penalties or get an opportunity to enjoy the rewards. So pay for performance means if one resource is not performing up to the level it's expected to, then some other resource, which by definition must be overperforming, will get the money that other resource is penalized. So the penalty from one resource goes as a reward to another resource. And this penalty rate is pretty steep. It starts at $2,000 per megawatt hour, increases to $3,500 starting with FCA 12 that occurred this year for 3 years. And then in FCA 15, it will get up to $5,455 per megawatt hour. The design of this penalty, the dollar amount, was intended to provide an incentive for gas-fired units to install dual fuel capability. This was not considered a penalty that would be large enough to incent someone to sign a firm gas supply contract. I think most people, certainly in New England, maybe the rest of the country, are well aware that New England has issues in the wintertime with firm gas supply being largely dedicated to home heating needs, and the amount of pipeline gas that is available for gas-fired generation to operate in New England, and gas-fired generation is 50% of the installed capacity and regularly provides about 60% of the energy on a daily basis. Some of those resources cannot operate on very cold winter days because of lack of firm gas supply. But the price to get firm gas supply is very large, and this penalty was never designed to create an incentive for gas-fired units to enter into firm supply contracts. Interesting piece of pay for performance, you can be a non-CSO resource. In other words, you can be outside of the capacity market. But if you are performing on a day when pay for performance is being applied, you can get part of the rewards, just like the other capacity supply obligation resources. So it's really designed to reward any resource, whether it's a CSO resource or a non-CSO resource, that actually performs during a time of need. So what is a time of need? These are determined by called scarcity pricing intervals. A scarcity pricing interval is triggered whenever 10-minute operating reserves. The ISO carries different quantities of reserves in 30 minutes that can respond to 30 minutes. Reserves can respond in 10 minutes. And then there are also what we call regulation resources that respond in much shorter time periods than that. But 30-minute reserves can be depleted as part of operating procedures. The ISO doesn't like to do that, but they do it on occasion when things are tight between supply and demand. They'll deplete their 30-minute reserves. They are very loath to deplete 10-minute operating reserves. Because once those 10-minute operating reserves are depleted, if there's a contingency on the system, if a generation unit goes down, a good sized one, or if a transmission line that's important goes down, we could be immediately into a load shedding event, or otherwise sometimes called rolling blackouts. So the triggering event for scarcity is whenever 10-minute operating reserves are being depleted or used for 5 minutes or more. Now, ISO dispatches on a 5-minute basis, so every 5 minutes they'll know whether they're using any of those operating reserves or not. Now, if it's just a 5-minute event, which it could be, then that penalty figure up above is based on a megawatt hour. So you would divide that figure by 12 to find out what the penalty would be for 5 minutes. Now, sometimes scarcity events last for an hour or 2 hours. They can even, there's no limit on how long they could last. It's not usual for them to last for many hours, but it's potentially possible. And because there are no excuses for failure to perform, it doesn't matter if you have approved maintenance schedule, doesn't matter if you are out of fuel and it's impossible for you to perform, and it doesn't matter if there's a calamity of some kind, an earthquake, or a tree fell down on your generating station and knocked the lines that service the power from the generation to the transmission system. Things that you may have no control over. That is not an excuse. You will still be penalized. And this is a potential penalty over 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Now, the penalty is prorated based on the load level compared to a full CSO load. So a few minutes ago, I was talking about a hypothetical 100 megawatt generator that gets a 100 megawatt capacity supply obligation. The ISO is looking for that generator to provide 100 megawatts on the hottest day of the year. If this scarcity pricing event occurs on the hottest day of the year, then that unit might be liable for the full 100 megawatts. But if it occurs on a day when loads are half of what they would be on that peak summer day, then the resource is only responsible for half of its capacity supply obligation. So it would only be responsible to provide 50 megawatts on a day when the system-wide load was 50% of what the peak summer load would be. So it doesn't mean that you're automatically penalized for your full capacity supply obligation every time a scarcity event occurs, and it doesn't always mean that it will be at those hourly prices. However, for folks who have variable resources, I'm thinking particularly of solar resources, wind resources, perhaps hydro resources, you are vulnerable to being penalized during these scarcity pricing intervals. And it is something new, and it's something you have to take into account when you're deciding whether you want to enter into the auction and take on a capacity supply obligation. What is the likelihood that you might run into a scarcity pricing event? And if it lasted for several hours, what would that cost be? And for some resources, maybe that operate very infrequently, you might not want to take on a capacity supply obligation because the penalties could easily exceed whatever you might earn in that entire year. It could happen with one event, or it could happen with a half a dozen events of shorter duration, either one long event or several small events. And this becomes very important when we start talking about CASPR, because everyone is, as I said, this is being implemented for the first time in the delivery year starting June 1st, 2018. No one knows exactly how this will play out. And so the first couple of years will be kind of a learning experience, and sometimes that can be scary for resource owners. This next slide just shows you some of the recent FCM results. If you look at the clearing price column, there's been kind of a steady downward movement in clearing prices. New England is in fundamentally an oversupply situation. We've shown some of the events that happened for each of those auctions, and the last bullet at each one is the RTR resources. In the FCA 9, 16 megawatts, in FCA 10, 56 megawatts. You can see the values there. And I'll just note that I'm not sure what happened in the second column. That should just read sequentially. First numbers June 2018, June 2019, then June 2020, June 21. I don't know if that got lost somewhere in one of the revisions that we did, but there's nothing different about the delivery year for FCA 11 and 12. They're exactly 1 year apart. So with that background, let's get into actual CASPR, which is what I think a lot of you are here for. CASPR stands for Competitive Auctions with Sponsored Policy Resources. You may see some old presentations that have the word subsidized policy resources rather than sponsored. This was one of the early debates within the NEPL stakeholder community, and some people objected to calling some resources subsidized when you could make claims, I think, that all resources have subsidies of one kind or another, various places in their fuel cycle. So to try to accommodate this disagreement, the ISO just changed the name. But a sponsored resource is very similar to the resources that were defined for the RTR. However, the RTR definition was expanded to specifically include large hydro. This is the Massachusetts legislation, requires approximately 1,000 megawatts of firm capacity to be purchased as an import. Most people assume this will come from Hydro-Quebec, although there's nothing in the legislation that says it has to. And this is one of the concerns going into the CASPR discussions, was how would this large 1,000 megawatts of potential hydro imports get a capacity supply obligation, and what would it do to the forward capacity market? The existing generators were concerned if it was allowed to offer in below its minimum offer price, that it would collapse the prices in the forward capacity auction. And that's the small bullet, and the next large bullet, the dual goals. Likewise, the state of Massachusetts didn't want to be purchasing a large hydro resource that would not get a capacity supply obligation, and require the ISO to buy some other generation in the forward capacity auction, even though that generation wouldn't be needed with the large hydro coming in. So CASPR was designed to try to create a mechanism whereby state or sponsored policy resources that meet the definition as of January 1st, 2018 could get a capacity supply obligation, avoid paying, as people said, paying twice for capacity, and not disrupt the functioning of the forward capacity market in a way that's detrimental to all the other resources. I listed a couple of other options that were rejected. One was a carbon adder. It was considered unfeasible by the states to try to do a carbon adder. The other was a two-tier capacity auction, kind of a simultaneous auction, but with two tiers of resources, with one tier clearing at one price and a different group of resources clearing at another price. Both of those ideas were rejected in favor of this CASPR option. FERC order in March of this year approved it. I gave you the docket number. It's not a particularly long order. I think it's around 70 pages. I would highly recommend it if you're seriously thinking of entering resources into the forward capacity market through CASPR. You would want to read this order carefully to understand a lot of the details are in there. The interesting, for those of us who like to watch these FERC orders and see what the different commissioners are saying, there were comments or dissent from all of the commissioners, which is a little unusual. It happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen that often. Most of the commissioners supported it, but they supported it for different reasons, and they all wrote their little comments explaining what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it. It's another reason I think this is one of the more interesting orders to read and to keep around so that you can get a glimpse into some of the ways the FERC tries to decide these issues. So how does CASPR operate? Okay, we talked about the forward capacity auction earlier. That runs the way it always has, and you end up with a quantity of resources being assigned capacity supply obligations. In FCA 12 that occurred just in February of 2018, I think it was a little over 35,000 megawatts of supply resources received capacity supply obligations. If you are a retiring resource, you go into the FCA, you get evaluated if you're needed for reliability. If you're not needed for reliability, you can get a capacity supply obligation, but you are then required to enter your resource into the substitution auction to be substituted, because you asked to retire, you didn't want to be there. The ISO makes you stay in the auction. If you get a CSO, you are then automatically entered into the substitution auction. If you are a new resource and you are clearing the forward capacity auction for the first time, you are prohibited from entering the substitution auction. This was done in part to prevent what they like to call fictitious entry. Someone who kind of creates a resource that they claim they'll build over the next 3 years. They have no intention of ever building it. They just want to clear the market, get a CSO, and then get bought out in the substitution auction and make some money with kind of not having to do anything. Now, they would lose a little bit of financial assurance that they had posted as part of the capacity supply obligation process. But it would essentially, the concern was that it would introduce a lot of gaming into the market. If you're an existing resource and you do not submit a retirement request, you have an option, if you want to enter all or part of your resource into the substitution auction. This was a controversial element and was done largely to try to improve liquidity or encourage more resources to make themselves available to the substitution auction and possibly get bought out. The substitution auction runs directly after the FCA. There are there's no space in between. And so everyone has already committed, if you're an existing resource and you decide you want to enter the substitution auction, you have to identify that well in advance. All of the supply resources for the substitution auction have already submitted their qualification packages just as if they were going to be in the FCA, and they're just waiting to see what if they can make a deal in the substitution auction. So they're all set in advance. Now, the demand bids, this is we call this a demand bid. The resources that have capacity supply obligations can be at or below that obligation that they just received from the forward capacity auction. Demand bids can also be negative. And supply bids, the bids from the renewable resources that meet the sponsored policy resource definition, are not reviewed for price at all. They can offer at any price they want. They can offer at zero. They can offer a negative amount. And again, the price you decide to offer in at is likely to influence whether or not you clear, and it has obviously financial issues associated with it. The first substitution auction will be run next February 2019 for FCA 13 and for all subsequent auctions, and then I just put in until it is modified. The only thing that's really constant about the forward capacity market is it changes a lot and it changes frequently. And some of those changes can be quite disruptive. You may have a particular business model in mind when you first enter in as a capacity supply resource, and over a period of time with the changes in the markets, you may have to reconsider whether you still want to stay in this capacity supply obligation cohort and continue to have this obligation. I think a number of existing generators are looking at the new pay for performance requirements, particularly, I would say, old, poorly performing units that break down a lot. They have to start seriously thinking about whether they take on a capacity supply obligation and they don't operate very often to begin with, and when they're called to operate, if they don't, they're going to be subject to penalties. They may say, this is just too much and we want to retire.
Hey, Paul, this is Warren. If I could interrupt,
yes, should go right ahead.
Finish up in about 8 to 10 minutes so we leave time for questions.
Yes. Yeah. No. I'm moving along well, I think. We'll see. So I've created a hypothetical FCA with just two resources, and this was created a few months back. It was before we knew that the Mystic units are actually going to retire. They have now submitted a retirement request, but this was just a hypothetical. Selecting Mystic as a resource that might choose to retire. It clears the auction at basically a $5 price, and you have this renewable energy resource with a contract, and the market monitor has determined that their minimum offer price in this example is $13 roughly. So the renewable energy resource was in the forward capacity auction at a $13 price. As you can see, that slope blue line went well below that $13 price and cleared at $5. And Mystic had a retirement bid, it looks like $4. Now, the bid may have been $4, but Mystic gets the clearing price of $5, even though they submitted a retirement bid at $4. And if we go to the next slide, we'll just walk through this example and show you how the money works. The FCA clears at $5. Mystic retirement bid clears because that was at $4, so the auction cleared above their retirement bid. They get a capacity supply obligation at $5, and that new renewable energy resource does not clear. It does not get a capacity supply obligation. So now we go to the substitution auction. There's only two parties here. We're assuming that the renewable energy resource submits an offer in the substitution auction of $2, and that Mystic, when they submitted their retirement bid, they're entered in at that $5 level, and they clear, and Mystic is retired. They get paid $3 a kilowatt month as a kind of a severance payment, or they get paid $36,000, and they don't have to perform in that future year. In fact, they're retired, they'll never perform again. If this is for the entire 2,000 megawatts of Mystic, this would amount to a $72 million payment to Exelon to retire the unit. The renewable energy resource will get paid $2 for the delivery period 2022, June 2022 through May 2023. And every year after that, it will be an existing resource, so it will be entered in at zero, and it will get paid the entire clearing price. And if you go back, you'll see that clearing prices have been $7, $5, $4.50 in the last 3 auctions. So the thinking here is that the renewable energy resource is willing to take this low payment of $2 for the first FCA in the hope of getting higher payments in all future FCAs, because it'll be an existing resource, next 20 years or however long it's around. Now, I just want to caution, there are a lot of details about how resources can offer in, how much variance they can do in their offers. I'd be happy to take questions about some of those. I will probably not be able to answer all the questions because the details are really complex, and some things would require me looking at the tariff for 30 minutes to try to sort out what was going to happen. But there are a lot of other design elements. If you're thinking about entering resources, renewable resources, into the FCA through the CASPR process, you will need to do some studying and research to see what the range of issues are. Couple of things I'll just hit very quickly. If we go back one slide, if that renewable energy resource could offer at a negative amount, it could have offered -2, and then Mystic would have got paid $5 plus $2, so it would have been a total of $7. If it offered at a positive $2, if it offered at a negative $2, which it might want to do because it might say it's so important for me to get a capacity supply obligation for the revenues in the future years that I'm willing to pay to get a capacity supply obligation in the first year. And in that case, the Mystic severance payment would be $7 a kilowatt month, more than double what you're seeing here, well over $70,000 a megawatt and well over probably $150 million to retire. And it also gets more complicated if there are multiple renewable resources in the substitution auction, and if there are multiple retirement resources, because then we have to start clearing people against each other and who gets cleared first. There's a lot of details that get involved here. Go to one more slide, and then I think we're into questions. The ISO recently announced the quantities of resources available both as demand bids in the FCA 13 that's going to occur next February, and also the supply offers. And what you're seeing in this Southeast New England category is 2,000 megawatts of Mystic. There's 2,062, and we know that approximately 2,000 of that is Mystic, and there's an additional 62 of either retiring resources or people who have existing resources that want to enter in a demand bid. And look down to the rest of pool, there's 112 megawatts of resources in the rest of pool that are also going to be entering demand bids. Against this, we're seeing supply offers of almost $2,000 in Southeast New England, 500 in Northern New England, and 350 in the rest of pool for almost 3,000 megawatts of supply offers. Now, I'll just make the obvious point. We're reasonably sure that Mystic will not be allowed to retire. The ISO's filed a petition down at FERC to prevent that. They want to give them a cost of service agreement. So if you take that 2,000 megawatts of Mystic out, because it won't be retiring, then what you're going to have in the substitution auction is really hardly 200 megawatts of demand bids with almost 3,000 megawatts of supply offers chasing after those 200 megawatts. So if you are going to offer in at a price as a renewable resource, as a supply offer, this might be where you would want to go negative in order to try to ensure you get a CSO. Because you might want to guess that other resources won't be able to go negative, but your resource, because you're either financially strong or maybe you have high REC payments that will cover you for the first year, you can afford to kind of take a loss for that first year in the hopes of getting capacity payments in future years. That's it. We're at questions. So let's, Warren, start shooting to me, and I'll answer as many as I can.
No, that was very helpful. You made something very complicated seem potentially understandable here. A basic question was asked: how does the forward capacity market deal with the different capacity factors of different generation sources? You know, things are measured in megawatt, not megawatt hours here.
Right. I'm going to guess that the question is about how do you compare a 100 megawatt gas-fired generation resource with a 100 megawatt nameplate wind resource. And the answer is that each resource has some kind of capacity rating assigned to it. For that gas-fired generator, it's derated based on equivalent forced outage rates for demand. So that straight 100 megawatts may be qualified at, let's say, 95 megawatts for purposes of a capacity supply obligation. Whereas the wind resource, if it's an onshore wind resource, it may be rated at 30% of its nameplate. So, you know, I think I was starting with a 100 megawatt wind resource would only get a capacity supply obligation for 30 megawatts. If it was an offshore wind resource, maybe it would get 40 or 45 megawatts because its capacity ratings are a little bit better. Every resource has kind of a capacity rating. These are known in advance. Photovoltaics has a capacity rating. Individual hydro units have their own capacity ratings based on historical flows and things like that. So the way they try to balance this out.
Could a variable production facility like solar or wind bid in combined with an energy storage project?
I believe the answer is yes. The exact mechanics of doing it, I'm not that familiar with. The obvious advantages to that is you are taking a lot of insurance out against the pay for performance penalties that might occur, and you might be able to boost. I'm thinking like a wind resource, maybe instead of a 30% capacity rating with the storage backing it up, maybe you get a 40% capacity rating or 50%. I believe the rules allow that, but the documentation and the proof that you would have to supply to the ISO could be a daunting task. So I just want to caution that it may sound good in theory, but the application of it may be difficult.
Yeah. Several people were asking and saying that this all seems, the performance penalties seems to be a really daunting hurdle for solar and wind projects because they can't know for sure if they're going to be available at the crucial times. Will the performance penalties likely push them out of the market?
That's an excellent question. It was raised a lot during both the debates on pay for performance and as well as the debates on CASPR. One of the options that's available is you can contract with some other resource to backstop you. So if I was a wind resource and I felt pretty comfortable that I could perform, meet my 30% summer capacity rating, I might, about let's say 100 megawatt resource. So I'm confident I can produce 30 megawatts almost all the time, but maybe I want to have the assurance of a contract with a gas generator who has an excess of 20 megawatts, that they will dedicate 20 megawatts available to me at all times, so that my capacity supply obligation is 30. Then if I have a 20 megawatt kind of cover with some other resource that's qualified for the capacity supply obligation, we have a contract that show it to the ISO. Then if a scarcity event occurs, I would only be possibly at risk for 10 megawatts of non-performance. Now, just to balance this, a wind resource that is, the wind's blowing hard, maybe it's operating at 50 or 60% of its normal capacity factor on the time of a scarcity event. That wind resource could earn some substantial rewards. So you have to try to balance, do I have a chance to earn rewards? How much might those be? Do I have a chance to be exposed to penalties? How much might those be? And try to balance those out, or at least understand what the risks are.
Okay. Somebody was asking about your theoretical example referring to Mystic, why would they choose to close if the forward capacity market clearing price is above their bid price? What's the
This is, again, an excellent question. The generators, as a group, complain that when they submit retirement bids, that the internal market monitor disallows some of their costs, so they're not allowed to reflect what they think is their true cost at which they would like to exit. And I'll just share with you that last week Exelon filed at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for a cost of service agreement for 2 years for FCA 13 and FCA 14, and they're asking for $12 per kilowatt month. Now, the forward capacity auction hasn't cleared at $12 except a very rare occasion in one part of southeastern Mass when Brayton was retiring, because there was the loss of 1,000 megawatts in that area caused a higher price. So Exelon is claiming in their filing at FERC that they need $12 per kilowatt month, and yet I think it's entirely possible that the IMM, using their scrutiny, might say that no, they should be able to operate at $4 per kilowatt month. And so that's the retirement bid that they're allowed to offer, is only at $4.
Okay.
So that's where the tension exists. Because Exelon would say that $4 is too low. That's what they would say. But that's all they'll be allowed to get based on the IMM review.
And they don't have any recourse in that situation?
Well, they can go to FERC and complain, and most of the time, I think FERC tends to side with the ISO. The thing is, you're looking at, the IMM is basically looking at a smaller set of costs than perhaps Exelon likes to look at. So they're saying that $4 should make you able to run year to year. And for whatever reason, Exelon is claiming now at FERC that they need $12. Now, that could get negotiated down to a lower number, but I don't see it going down as low as $4. But
okay. Somebody wanted a clarification on a point you were talking about, partially from your hypothetical example, which made it sound like that CASPR's awarding CSOs only a lock-in price for 1 year. Is it still possible to lock in the price for multiple years? Or are we misunderstanding what you're saying?
No, the short answer on CASPR, you're not allowed a multiple lock-in. Nor I don't think you would want to lock in at your CASPR price. In the forward capacity auction, the main auction that occurs first, a new resource that clears can lock in at that clearing price for up to 7 years. They have to make the election at the time. They can lock in for 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 7 years. And it's just a benefit that's being provided to new resources, let's say a new gas peaking resource that clears, can get certainty that that clearing price will be theirs for the next 7 years, regardless of what happens in the next FCA. But in the normal FCA, you get a price that's only guaranteed for 1 year, and then the next year the FCA will set the price for the year after that. In CASPR, what you're saying is I'm willing to either take a very low price or even pay someone, because I think in the future, when I'm an existing resource, I will get a much higher price or an adequate price in the forward capacity auction, whether it's that $4 price or $5.50 or $7.50, which can vary from year to year.
Okay,
good. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, we're coming to the end of the hour, but there are a lot of questions, so we're going to, if it's okay with you, run over 5 minutes.
I can do that, yes, not a problem.
Good. Do you have any sense of how the addition of the substitution auction will impact the clearing price for the primary auction?
I would say there's a lot of speculation by a lot of people as to how that might do that. I think the ISO's goal is to make that minimal, but at the same time, there are some people that are saying that someone may submit a low retirement offer just so they can get into the substitution auction. Maybe resources would do that, but I like to think that the ISO has thought these things through and has safeguards in place so that manipulation won't occur. Whether there's an incentive that people haven't identified to make people to either increase or lower their prices in the FCA, the initial FCA, I'm not aware of anything that's been identified so far. There's kind of speculation that maybe there's something there, but we'll have to see a few auctions and maybe then we'll find out.
Okay. Now, somebody wrote in, this is back on the question of PV plus storage, saying that ISO New England doesn't allow hybrid resources. Is that true, and does that apply to the situation of solar plus storage?
Yeah, I'm not sure hybrid, yeah. There may be language that they don't like hybrid resources. They originally had pairings in the early FCAs of winter resources with summer resources, and I think they've abandoned that because of issues of figuring out who was actually responsible when something went wrong. What I would say is allowed is if you submit a qualification package for a resource that has multiple elements to it, the ISO could accept that or could reject it, depending on whether they thought it's really feasible that your combination of resources would actually work together as intended. And it's possible that there's a detail in there that does specifically exclude PV and storage from pairing up, because maybe the ISO's already determined that that's too difficult a situation for them to manage. But I think in theory, if you submit your qualification package for your resource, this would probably be, actually my advice would be to have a conversation with the ISO well in advance and find out whether it's allowed. And if I've misstated, I apologize, but I believe you can present a package in a qualification package of a set of resources that together will meet the capacity supply obligation that you're asking to be qualified for.
Good. Well, I have two more questions, one very specific and one quite broad in general, so the big punchline question. The specific one is, how often are there scarcity events?
Since pay for performance was approved almost 3 years ago, the ISO has been tracking system events, and I would put the number at around a half a dozen a year. And in some years there might be one or two, and they might only last for short periods of time. In other years there might be half a dozen or more. They could last for short periods of time or perhaps long periods of time. There were, I'm trying to remember now, I know most recently there was a Andrews Square, trying to think what happened. Some transmission line grounded and caused a fault that threw the ISO into depleting 10-minute reserves because it happened so fast. Now, it only lasted for, I believe, 15 or 20 minutes, but there was a scarcity pricing event this year in, I believe it was March of 2018. It was just kind of an unusual transmission line failure that caused the 10-minute reserves to be started to be depleted, so a scarcity pricing event was declared. Even though pay for performance wasn't in effect, the ISO identified it as such because everyone wants to know how often these things are going to occur. And there's some concerns that in the wintertime they may be more likely now because of issues around fuel risks and performance of the system on very, very cold winter days.
Okay, and interesting. And so then the big sort of wrap-up question is, what is CASPR likely to mean for clean energy project development in the region?
That is the big question, and it's really,
is there any way to project that?
To handicap it, it's to be determined. I'll offer this example. 200 megawatts of RTR resources on an annual basis would have been close to being able to accommodate the 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind resources that Massachusetts is planning to build, because they're planning to do it in 400 megawatt increments. And with a let's pick up 40% capacity factor for offshore wind. A 400 megawatt nameplate is really only 160 megawatts of firm capacity. So if you had a 200 megawatt RTR, you could bring in 160 megawatts of offshore wind on the Massachusetts total of 1,600, for 4 different capacity periods, and they would have gotten through. CASPR was designed to handle something like the 1,000 megawatts that's going to come in all in 1 year. If there's 1,000 megawatts of retiring resources, then those 1,000 megawatts of hydro resources will be able to pair up and get in. So I think it has the potential to provide some benefit. Whether it actually will, we'll find out after we have a few of these substitution auctions. And I think one of the questions is going to be, will that Hydro-Quebec contract that Massachusetts signed require them to get a capacity supply obligation, in which case they'll be highly motivated to use CASPR, bid a negative number, and get a capacity supply obligation in order to meet the requirements of the legislation. So I think it has the potential to help, but there's no certainty that it's going to help. And in some ways, it could be less useful than the prior RTR exemption, even though that was limited to 200 megawatts. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. But I don't have the crystal ball that this will definitely encourage or definitely discourage renewable resources from getting capacity supply obligations.
Well, like all your other answers, carefully phrased and clear. This has been very useful, Paul. I feel I understand CASPR much better, and I suspect many of the folks on the call feel the same way. Thank you very much for participating, and we will be having more RPS collaborative webinars in the future. So enjoy the rest of the day, folks.